to see it. Well, we probably need to start talking about the event to which we're going to be talking about, which of course now is historically, we have now passed the 150th anniversary, but that's okay because the topic, the character, the subject of this discussion is the Grand Duke Alexander, the fourth son of
Alexis.
the Tsar of Russia.
Grand Duke
And
Alexis.
he is still in the United States, and he'll be here until, when did he leave? Was it sort of late February?
It was mid-February.
Mid-February, all right.
Mhm.
So we still have him in the country, but we're going to backtrack a bit because at this point he's probably where, in Louisville or somewhere like that, I imagine. He's already been out to Nebraska.
Right.
He's already hunted the bison. He's been to Denver. He's been chased. I want to get into this. He's been chased by a young woman from St. Louis who is just convinced that she's going to convince him to marry her and make her a Grand Duchess. But anyway,
Mortifying.
so we're talking, of course, about the royal, what was called the Royal Buffalo Hunt that became famous, in subsequent years and decades. Here in Nebraska, I'm coming from a location maybe a little over a mile from where the Union Pacific train that carried him out to western Nebraska passed. So where we left off the last time was we had him getting out to North Platte, Nebraska. It is mid-January, and he is met there by Bill Cody, and he and his party of other Russian dignitaries are going to be escorted down for a buffalo hunt. So let's pick up the story there then.
Okay.
So you've been out there. What were your sort of impressions of the terrain? Was that sort of what you expected, or were you looking for something, that was flatter or more wild or whatever?
Well, I guess it's interesting because of course now even though you can go out and sort of if you have access, you can get out to where the actual campsite was and everything. There are little roads and things built up now, and of course somebody owns that land.
Right.
So it's hard to completely, and there are fences and things, so it's hard to completely imagine what it would be like for everything to be wide open. And having grown up in the South, because I grew up around New Orleans, just to be in places where there are those open stretches of land is pretty stunning. I mean, not far from where the buffalo hunt took place, you can actually, there's one little park that I drove by where you can actually see some of the wagon wheel trails from the Great Migration West, right?
Yep.
And that kind of gives you some impression of what the terrain is like out there. Big open stretches of land. And now of course, as I said, marred by roads and fences and things, but still,
Right.
it's pretty impressive as somebody who grew up in the southern part of the country to see those open stretches of land.
You could see it why it was prime bison country then.
Absolutely. Mhm.
In reading these accounts, they're probably the best online account. You've done more research in that than I was able to do. I relied a lot upon the New York Herald reports that came out. They had at least one stringer, and as I went back and reread those accounts, I'm getting the impression that there were probably a couple of stringers, or maybe even more, that were there because of just the different styles in the reporting. And so I wonder how much trust can we place? Because as I think about it, here's somebody with a notepad and a pencil or a pen who's making notes, and then he gives that to a dispatch rider who then rides across wild country to a telegraph office in a little village along the railroad. And then that is given to a telegraph operator, and he sits there and he taps out the story that ends up eventually in the offices of the New York Herald, where I assume someone or someones took that information and then wrote the story.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what my feel. What do you feel about it?
Well, I mean, I think that for the day, that's about the best we can hope for, right? I
Right.
mean, and I certainly assumed that the news stories about the hunt were the most reliable sources. Alexis did not write anything about it himself. Sadly, it would have been
Yeah.
lovely. I know, had he kept a journal of that or written letters about it, but he didn't. Custer didn't write anything about it. And so the only other account we have is the account of Buffalo Bill,
Right.
who, although there certainly was probably some truth to his stories, he had sort of a, flamboyant nature in and of
Showman.
himself. He was
Yes.
a showman, and it made sense for him to exaggerate or embellish the stories for his own purposes. I mean, not only was he a showman, but like this is a great story for anybody, right? To get
Right.
to go buffalo hunting with a Grand Duke. So it makes perfect sense that he would have wanted to embellish and play up this event as much as
Right.
possible. So I don't think we can rely too much on his versions. I think we have to look at the news versions and then kind of take it from there and see where things line up with Buffalo Bill and any other kinds of sources that we can find about it.
Right. Yeah. So they arrive. Let's see if I remember. They left here, I think, Omaha on the 12th, and arrived there on the 13th, which would have been a Sunday. From the first report in the Herald, that particular reporter really says we're going to do this we're going to rest on the Sabbath, which would have been Sunday, and then we're going to hunt Monday and Tuesday. Then we're going to end up on Thursday. Well, apparently that was shortened because they didn't stay, as far as I can tell, they didn't stay that long there. They had this 60-mile jaunt across country that took them about 8 hours by wagon. And that was not without incident. They'd stopped at a place called Medicine Creek and they changed horses and they had lunch. And then they arrived about sunset at the site. Several hours later, George Custer and his party come walking into camp because their wagon the ambulance that they were in had broken down. And so they said they had to walk about 5 miles through snow to get there. So it wasn't without incident. What was sort of in your mind, kind of having been there and seeing the site and sort of maybe imagined how the tents were arranged? What can you sort of share what your thoughts were? I mean, what would that camp have looked like back then?
Well, so, and you've mentioned this before, right? There are some archaeologists who have done
Yes.
some surface level excavations there. Unfortunately, I wish they could have done sort of deeper excavation, but
Right.
they were able to determine based on photographs from the period and from their own excavations, that there were these tents arranged. There are certain tents. The Grand Duke had his tent, which was,
Right.
pretty, fancy as far as camping tents go, right?
Right.
And there were other tents for the other parties as well. And then there was a mess tent, essentially a big tent for eating. But
Yeah,
there
they
would have been,
basically put 2 hospital tents together.
right. But I mean, there were a number of tents there, but then there would have just been like open land and
Right.
snow. I mean,
Right.
and so it's, but the descriptions of the supplies that they got out there for these men
Yeah.
are impressive, right? Like,
Yeah.
you and I, if we thought about going on a buffalo hunt or if camping, we would not be hauling all of this stuff. But I mean, this was a royal hunt with some
Yeah.
pretty big name characters. And so there was all of this meat and champagne and all sorts of other things brought out there. So
Right.
while photographs, have you give you this sense of kind of a sparse existence, these tents that are made out of canvas,
Right.
and these little like warmers, these little ovens that they had in these tents, but they weren't roughing it entirely. I mean, there
Right.
were
Exactly. Yeah. Well, one of the
so
things that the archaeologists found there were lead wrappers off the top of French
Yes.
champagne bottles.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been nice if they could have done. I don't know if they made use of the, what is it, ground sort of penetrating radar kind of thing where you haul it
I don't think they
across the.
did. And I
Yeah,
think there, you know, there was a little bit of, I think there was a little bit of tension with the local property owners with
okay,
regard to doing that sort of thing.
right,
You know, and so they didn't go down, you know, very deep at all, just kind of surface level. I don't think they used any of that kind of, you know, stuff that you're describing.
right,
But yeah, they did find, like, you know, some nails and some other things that would have
right,
been used, you know, with regard to like putting the tents up, and then some wrappers from champagne bottles,
right.
and
Yeah, I
I think
think
they got
they found they had
buttons.
maybe a picket, you know, a broken picket, where what you would do is these cavalry would take and have a spike with a loop
Mhm,
on the end, and they
mhm.
would drive that into the ground. Then they would
Right,
hook
tie
their,
the
you know,
tents
attach their
down.
horse to it
Mhm.
overnight. They did not go down there by themselves. They had an escort.
Yes.
And so they were met not far out of North Platte by a company of U.S. Second Cavalry to escort them down there. When they got there, there was another. There were two companies. I think it was Company E and Company K or something like that, who were going to be providing guard service. And of
Mhm.
course, the reason for that was, if you go back and read, is sort of, I don't want to say it's amusing, but it's interesting the way it was written. That way, the one reporter described the potential danger of the Duke being scalped, and we've got to have all these. And they took over the 20 wagons, I think it says, of supplies that General Sheridan had promised to the Lakota, who were going to show up as many as 1,000. The one reporter thought, and so this was all done, according to the reporter says, to basically bribe
Mhm.
the warlike Lakota from scalping the Duke or the Grand Duke. So um, let's talk a little bit about the larger party itself. We've got the Grand Duke, we've got all of these various officers, starting with the highest ranking officer, Philip Sheridan. There's a couple of other generals, including George Custer, and then various captains and things like that. They made this invitation to Lakotas. Let's talk a little bit about what that, and why did they invite the Indians there?
Well, so it was suggested that early on that Grand Duke Alexis might be interested in seeing these, you know, Native Americans
Right,
and in their natural habitat, and that it would be kind of a great show for the Grand Duke if they would maybe show their hunting skills and even some of their, you know, maybe their local culture and practices. And at some point, Grand Duke Alexis had mentioned that he was very interested in Native Americans. And I think I mentioned this in one of our earlier talks, that, you know, while the visit was, you know, very much a kind of a, you know, superficial, showy, let's take him out to balls and dinners kind of thing. In
right.
some ways, there was actually, you know, there was a deeper diplomatic reason for the visit. And it was clear that Grand Duke Alexis was interested in a lot of the things that he was seeing. So I'm sure there were times when the things he was dragged through were tedious, but he also expressed interest in all of these various things. He wanted to know more about the United States. He wanted to know more about our industry and these kinds of things. And so, so he was curious about the different people who lived in the United States. One of the things that he did write about, though incredibly briefly, is the difference between what he observed, the differences between Northerners and Southerners. So he was observing, you know, people in the United States. So it makes sense that he would want to know a little bit more about the Native Americans. And Russians were fascinated with the quote unquote Wild West. They continued to be
Yeah,
well into the 20th century. I mean, you know, some of the favorite films of the top Bolsheviks were these, like, you know, Westerns. So, you know, I
yeah,
guess there are some similarities they could relate to with kind of attempting to, you know, conquer the far reaches of their empire with Cossacks and so on. And, you know,
Right.
so they saw the similarities between the United States extending westward. So yeah, so it makes sense that Grand Duke Alexis himself was also very interested in this.
Yeah. Well, that was, you know, I think one of the, who was it, Cardinal Bodner, and was one of the, what was a Swiss artist, and did a lot of Western. And of course, then, if I remember correctly, the Western history, and particularly with later Bill Cody's Wild West show was extremely popular in Europe.
Yeah.
And,
Mhm.
you know, in France, and particularly in Germany, in England, that there's a great deal of interest at that
Yeah.
particular
Yeah.
time in this genre, kind of like what happened to us once we got around to producing Western movies and Western
Mhm.
TV shows, you know. Um, so we there was that similar kind of an interest there. So the tribe there, the band of Lakota that they picked were the Brule, or the Burnt Thigh, uh, particular band of Lakota. Um, I think it's Shinkangu or something like that, I think is what they call themselves. Why that particular band, and particularly this character that comes up a lot in the reporting, Spotted Tail?
So as best I can remember, I mean, this particular guy already had a relationship with members of the U.S. military. So it made sense to reach out to someone with whom they already had a relationship.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the hunt then itself. There's really one big day, and I believe that was on Tuesday. This would have been what, the 14th,
Mhm.
where they go out. Can you sort of share what the Duke experienced on that day? Because that I think they had sort of taken pot shots at some bison in the distance as they rode down to the camp, but the big hunt itself takes place on the 14th.
Yeah, so I mean, it had been decided, you know, in advance, and that they would allow Grand Duke Alexis to get the first kill, which makes perfect sense, right? Um, and Alexis did get the first kill. But you know, there are lots of stories surrounding that, and I think you and I have alluded to that already, that there are, you know, later Buffalo Bill would tell stories about Alexis not being a very good shot,
Right.
and that perhaps Buffalo Bill loaned him his trusty horse, and even perhaps his trusty rifle.
Right. Right.
You know, and those things may be true. You know, Buffalo Bill's horse was apparently very experienced at hunting.
Yeah.
And while I don't know that much about horses, at least from reading, you know, the things that I did, that actually matters. A horse that knows what
Yeah.
it's doing in those kinds of situations. Alexis may have needed a different gun from the one that he was initially trying to shoot the buffalo with, right? Because he was initially trying to shoot it, we think, with a revolver, which
Right.
was a gift that he'd received earlier in the trip. But some of the other stories are undoubtedly exaggerated.
Yeah.
You know, the portrayal of Alexis as a bad shot and a bad hunter are probably not true. He had experience hunting. You know, that would have been a common pursuit in Russia anyway, and then
Yeah.
certainly something that, you know, as a member of the royal family, he would have participated in. The one thing, of course, that, you know, is often referred to in these stories about the first day of the hunt is how, you know, when Alexis got that first kill, there was lots of celebrating and hats were thrown in the air, and then of course champagne bottles were
Right.
uncorked, and so you know, so the other members of the camp were hoping that he would be greatly successful, because then they could all participate in this
Right.
drinking. In the end, nobody's really sure how many buffalo they killed that first day.
They sort of left a string of them when you read the account. The one reporter actually, you know, he says, I was allowed to ride along with them, right? So he was sort of there reporting on that. And from what I understand, they kind of left a string
Yeah, and
bison
so,
because they over miles.
yeah, and there are photographs from the buffalo hunt that showed like these buffalo tails in, so we don't know exactly how many, but it's clear that they did successfully kill some. And of course that was actually later criticized because
Yeah,
if they just left these carcasses everywhere, that was
yeah,
wasteful. And meanwhile, the Native Americans were always very good about using the buffalo parts. I mean, they weren't just
right.
going to kill something for fun and leave it
Yeah.
around. So, but yeah,
Kind
so
of like kind of like that scene from Dances with Wolves,
yes,
where they find all those
yeah,
carcasses, across the plains. So,
yeah. So it sounds like the first day of the buffalo hunt was enormously successful, and Grand Duke Alexis got to experience life on the western frontier, and everyone had a good time.
they it was not without incident. From what I understand, there were a number of people falling off of horses, and surprisingly, though, there are no broken bones or any fatalities. But they're racing down. Since you've been to that country, and I'm in the process right now of trying to build a 3D model of that. And there is some really rugged, steep, precipitous terrain. In fact, the reporter even mentions how difficult it was to get down into some of these areas to hunt the buffalo. And then
Mhm.
when they did chase them, the buffalo would be up blind canyons, and even they couldn't get out of the canyon. So
Yeah, yeah,
it's not, maybe people might think of it as, large areas like Oklahoma or Kansas where it's flat. This particular area they were hunting was very rugged, riven with ravines
and
and
rocks, and yeah,
places. So it was, and then there was, I think they were talking about snow, maybe as much in some areas as much as 18 inches deep.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. So yeah, huge terrain, differences in elevation, not huge differences necessarily, but just rough terrain,
right,
snow. There's a story, I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was Sheridan who apparently just read Alexis the Riot Act with some very colorful language when Alexis shot at some buffalo and sent them running in a different direction right toward him. If that, am I remembering that story correctly?
I don't recall that, but that's very possible.
And again, it might be
Yeah,
apocryphal, it might just be a fun story, but you can imagine that probably with a bunch of guys with guns on this terrain, there could have been some
riding along
carelessness and shooting in in different directions,
and getting your horse up near a animal that's galloping as fast as you are, weighs as much as a ton, and has these really sharp, pointy things on its head.
yeah, yeah,
So, yeah. So it's amazing that I don't think there were, at least among the American and Russian dignitaries, there weren't any difficulties. I don't know if we ever heard about what happened with the Indians themselves, if there were any, but they were amazingly good at that. In fact, it actually impressed
mhm,
the Grand Duke Alexis at how skillful they were with their arrows. In fact, one of the stories is that one of the young men presented him with an arrow that was covered tip to tip with the blood of a bison that
mhm,
had gone completely through the bison, had killed it, but had gone completely through the skin and the organs and the tissue and the muscle, and came out the other side in the
yeah,
ground, and presented that to him as a trophy. And I think later Alexis then gives him some trinkets or something to in reciprocity. So yeah, it was an interesting thing. So the big day of the hunt was successful. They cap it off that night then with a feast among the Lakota
mhm.
in the camp nearby. Um, let's talk a little bit about that. What's sort of your thoughts or impressions of what happened there? One of the reports, and it reads a lot like a modern day tabloid.
Yes,
where it talks about, these guys eyeing, Miss Spotted Tail, the teenage daughter of the head of that particular band. And who gets the first kiss, and Lieutenant Clark, and he goes and he presents her with, I think, some earrings or something.
Mhm.
But George Custer goes up and puts the ear, so let's,
Roots in, and yeah, and it even, I'm trying to remember exactly how they described it, but it was something about the way he put the earrings on her.
right,
So rather than, he puts it in one ear, and then rather than going to the other side to put in the other ear,
right.
he
He
puts
puts
it
his arm
this
around her.
way so that he
Yeah.
can put his arms around her to put the earring in the other ear. And that's Custer doing that. So, but there was, so that, yes, there was a story
And
like,
he's
there.
married at this point to
Oh
Livia.
yeah, very much so. And his wife becomes a part of the party when they go south at the very end of the trip. His wife
Okay.
actually helps to
I
recruit
didn't
young
know that.
women.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, his wife, Custer's wife, joins the party when they go to Kentucky, and then they head south all the way to New Orleans. And she is traveling with them at that point. She is actually one of the people, well, she is kind of charged with the task in Kentucky of rounding up some local young ladies who can travel with them all the way down to New Orleans, so that they
Oh.
have sort of a party of pretty young girls. And so she's on the riverboat going down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, and comments on, the Grand Duke being, stunned by all these beautiful young women and that sort of thing. So, and this goes back to
It
what
has
we
a sort of, unfortunately, sort of has a modern ring to it.
Yeah, it kind of in a grotesque kind of way. Yeah. Well, I mean, so, of course, that I mentioned this earlier, that's one of the things that the press made a lot of is, Alexis and his having an eye for women, and, him being an eligible black bachelor and all this sort of thing. And of course, not many people really knew the whole story. They didn't know that he was really, in love with this other woman. So
Right.
it made sense for them to think like, oh, well, let's bring a bunch of pretty girls along to entertain him and give him
Right.
dancing partners and that sort of thing. And what an amazing, opportunity for these young women, right? But yeah,
Of course, they're
especially in the,
thinking, I might be a Grand Duchess someday.
yeah, but especially in, in light of the last couple of years,
Yeah.
the Me Too movement, it does sort of, sound really kind of awful. But, it makes perfect sense for the time. And we always have to remember that. So, but yeah, so the press made a lot of this story with Miss Spotted Tail as well.
Yeah.
And so we don't know how accurate it is. It does, it does sound like, but I mean, we know by this point Custer was a pretty big name, right? He was very famous. He was also a celebrity of sorts. So, I mean, he may have been having a little bit of fun there too, and knew that he was in a situation where he could, push the envelope a bit and nobody was going to call him out.
Right. Well, and he does end up apparently giving her a kiss.
Yeah.
Or she returned the, who
Yeah.
knows? I mean, here you got all this straight sort of reporting in 4 of the 5 stories, right? They did this and they did that, but then you get this one guy who I that's why I asked you about the veracity of the chain of custody of the information, because you just got to feel that this guy is not on the prairie with them. He's gotten a report and he's inflated this report because there've been all these stories about Custer and so on. So he takes these little nuggets of information that have been telegraphed laboriously from the frontier, and then builds this story, like I said, sort of tabloid style.
Yeah, and this is one of those instances where you think like, did any of those soldiers who were accompanying, who were there to guard the hunt, right? To guard the Grand Duke Alexis. Did any of these people witness this? Did any of these people write this down in a letter? But since none of those people were famous people, their letters have probably long been lost.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's kind of only the famous people whose letters get held onto and put into collections. And so who knows what other,
Right.
what other information about these various events, including Grand Duke Alexis's, skill at hunting. I mean, like all those other people would have witnessed those things, and had they
Right.
written it down and it been preserved somehow, we would know. And
Yeah.
we just don't know. So
Yeah. And then, of course, there was the diplomatic side of this thing, because you wanted the hunt to go well. And in fact, this actually, the very last New York Herald report is this sort of summary of what happened in the hunt, what was accomplished. And basically it said, we had this, and what, of course, there's a Katakazi affair, but then there was another prince got stalked or something like that. There was a reference to this other
okay.
Russian prince, right? But that it says that the buffalo resolved all questions of tension between the U.S. and the Katakazi affair and
Yeah.
the United States government, the Grant administration. So we've got the hunt's been successful. They've had this party. They have this powwow inside of the tent. I don't know if do you recall? Can we talk a little bit about that? Do you remember sort of? I had to refresh my memory on it too. So
yeah, I don't really remember that so much as the kind of the festivities. I don't remember the serious discussion as much as the festivities.
Yeah, well, so from the report again, for what the reports are worth, is that they Spotted Tail, his wife, and his teenage daughter were in the Grand Duke's tent, along with Phil Sheridan and other staff officers and a translator, who then Sheridan thanked him for his for coming, for entertaining and being so gracious in helping make this the hunt a success. And then he would, at that point, then he officially would turned over these 20 wagon loads of supplies to his people, to which then Spotted Tail replies that he's very grateful. He had the opportunity to meet a son of the great father across the seas, in Russia, and that he asked basically two things: is that he could continue to allow to have his people hunt buffalo, in other words, move off the reservation, and that then also, oh God, what was the other thing? There was a second thing, and that they could have more than one local place to shop, basically, because he had been back east, and he said, look, I've been back east. I've seen how you white men have all of these different stores that you can go to, and you can, find who gives the best offers and the best deals. Says, we have only one place we can shop. And we're pretty sure, he didn't say that, but the implication is we're pretty sure they're gouging us. So we would like if you would arrange for us to at least have more than one place that we can go buy our supplies on the reservation. And Sheridan basically replied, well, I will, I'll see what I can do. I'll pass that, your concerns on to the appropriate authorities, the Office of Indian Affairs, or, whoever was responsible for that. So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm the one that's talking.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I didn't remember all the details of that particular, sidebar regarding Indian policy.
All this intrigue and romance and gossip going on. Then you've got a serious So next morning they're up bright and early. They pack themselves into the Russian party, pack themselves into the ambulances. I assume then their escort follows them up there. There's one episode that maybe we can touch on where Buffalo Bill, William Cody, demonstrates his skills as a stagecoach driver.
Yeah, apparently he took Grand Duke Alexis on a bit of a wild ride.
Yeah.
And scared the pants off of him, and Alexis made it clear he didn't want to do that again.
Well, what's interesting is that in all of the Wild West shows that Cody produced or co-produced, because he had other partners from various times. Every one of those has the Deadwood stage in it. And that, because apparently that was sort of famous, he was kind of linked to, he never drove the Deadwood stage. He drove stage for a short period of time for the Overland Express Company, but they always had, every show had that Deadwood stage in there. And that's probably, they gave people an opportunity to see what what he might have experienced, because when you're driving horses hard across a rutted trail, I just can't, pell mell, I just couldn't, I can see why he'd be frightened.
Yeah, it's probably jostling your back teeth, right? I mean, it
Right.
has to feel like every part of your body's falling apart.
Yeah, because they did say that his particular ambulance was sprung a little better than the others that the rest of the party had to be in. So there was some, but there are references of their going down, of broken springs, and shattered axles and spokes breaking and all that. So
Yeah.
it wasn't when I drove there, I was behind a nice, comfortable, modern SUV on a paved road.
Yeah.
But you look across that countryside and say, oh my God, how did they do that on a wagon? And
Yeah,
particularly
yeah.
galloping along at what, 15, 20 miles an hour?
Yeah, I'm sure it was quite an experience.
Well, okay, we're getting long here. So let's we getting back to safely to
Wait,
North
there
Platte.
are two more things I want to mention really
Yes, go ahead.
quickly.
Yes.
So I just want to mention some side effects from the buffalo hunt that we kind of alluded to already, but so the Grand Duke Alexis buffalo hunt was one of the most reported parts of his trip,
Right.
and it got a lot of attention in the press for reasons that we wouldn't think of for that time period. So one thing was that the ASPCA had just been founded in the 1860s. It was only a couple of years old at this point,
Right.
and that New York Herald reporter, who whose accounts we rely so heavily on, commented on the buffalo hunt and mentioned the founder of the ASPCA by name over and over again. His name was Henry Berg, and so he like poked fun at this guy Henry Berg, like, oh, he really wouldn't be happy at what's happening here, and this poor guy was already in the news because he was attempting to interfere with various events that were being held, like pigeon shoots and things like that. So he was already, on the radar, so to speak, for the media of the time. And so they saw this as an opportunity to really poke fun at him, but it also raised awareness to this new organization whose sole purpose was to try and prevent cruelty to animals. And then the other thing that we see happening is that in the wake of the hunt, there's a greater interest, even at the governmental level, in the preservation of bison, because this really highlighted the decimation of the herds, the fact that these animals were dying in huge numbers, and it was something that needed to be addressed. And so there was actual government legislation in the wake of this hunt to start to try and protect the herds.
Yeah, and that there are some reports of subsequent criticizing the fact of what was going on there.
Yeah, just killing and leaving all that behind. It's one thing to kill them and eat them. It's another thing to just hunt them for sport and then not do anything with the
cut the tail off.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think the yearling bull that which was the first animal that Alexis killed, he ended up also taking the head.
Yes.
Supposedly taking that back, the tail.
Yeah, there were a couple of heads taken. We talked about that last time where those have ended up, but for the most part, it sounds like a lot of stuff was just left there. And so.
Well, a few months later, after this event, talking about the sort of conservation, the concerns of the, what do they call that? Not factory hunting, but market hunters, and so on. Just a few months later, there in the summer, Congress passes the creation of Yellowstone National Park.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
And of course, Yellowstone National Park was the last preserve of genetically distinct bison. There had been bison had been captured and bred with cattle, and so you got the cattle and beefalo or whatever you want to call them. But the last sort of pure genetic herd was actually dwindled down. There's a whole story about the guy that was in there, poaching these bison because they were the last. You
Mhm.
could not find bison anywhere by late 1880s, early 1890s. You couldn't find them. They were
Mhm.
only in Yellowstone. And so
Yeah.
that because Congress set that land aside, we have bison. They weren't exterminated.
Well, and I think I just read within the last week or so that they're now, like, they were taken off the endangered list
Yeah,
at some point not all that long ago. And if you ever go to Custer National Park,
yeah.
there's a huge,
That way from me.
yeah, I mean, like, there's a huge number there. It's fantastic to, I went there a number of years ago, and driving through the park, I mean, you literally get stuck in the middle of a herd, and you just
Herd.
have to sit there and kind of wait for them to mosey on
Yeah,
because you can't
yeah,
move. And they
yeah.
are so enormous. We were in an SUV, and I wanted so badly to roll down my window and pet this thing. They're just massive, and
Yeah.
you're in this big vehicle, and you still feel like if this thing wanted to, it could roll this SUV.
6 feet at the hump. Many of the bulls.
They're just
6
they're
feet.
just beautiful in their
Yeah.
own weird way.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the driving force about a lot of what I've been doing and trying to build that momentum. Just as a reference, we have now well over 500,000 bison. About
Okay.
85% of those are in private herds, guys like Ted Turner and little guys like, what's his name? Cross Timbers, the Bison Ranch down in Kansas or Oklahoma, actually. But there's over 500,000 of them now.
Amazing. Yeah.
Which is a great improvement from the 25 that were there in Yellowstone. So, all right. So he goes from here. He has one more hunt. He gets to Denver. They take him out to hunt there, and then maybe what we'll do is we'll sort of pick up the story for our last episode from Denver back to Louisville with Libby to New Orleans, and we'll finish up the grand tour of the Duke's Grand Tour of the United States. So you good
Sounds
with that?
good. Sounds good.
Lee, thank you so much. We've had a few little technical glitches and things, and I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that this video works. Because I haven't done it on my laptop. I've always used my desktop, which is
Yeah.
actually still running. Funny. Okay, good. Lee, thank you very much.
Sure. See you
Okay.
soon.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.